Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic will be discoveries. Discover check, discover attack, how to prevent them, and traps that you can set or avoid falling into. Well, let's get started with our first example in this lesson. Here we go. Before we go any further, let's evaluate the situation where we stand at the moment. Well, right now we can see that black has material advantage because black has a rook, while white's only other piece in addition to the queen is the knight. Also, on the pawn count, we can announce that black is a pawn up. So, in the overall count, black is up 3 points, which is quite significant, especially when most of the pieces have been already traded off the board. In this position, it was white's turn, and white made a tricky move. White moved the queen to c2. Now, what's important here is, especially if you play on the black side, my advice always is, after each move of the opponent, make sure you stop for a second and ask yourself, what does my opponent want to do? And this certainly is one of those moments when the opponent is trying to do something very tricky and sneaky. If it was white's turn again, or to illustrate that simplest, for example, if black makes kind of an ignorant move and moves the pawn to c6, that would allow white's threat. And in fact, white had 2 threats, although both were based on the same concept. Namely, to move the knight out of the way, which in turn will give a check to the black king, and at the same time attack another very valuable piece. So one of those excellent moves would be now knight e5 check from the queen, and at the same time attacking black's queen. Or the other one, doing the same thing from the other side with knight c5 would accomplish just that. The black king would need to get out of the check, and then knight captures the queen on d7. So now we realize that after white plays queen c2, white has a devastating threat. Now, from black's perspective, it's very important to recognize the threat and to know how to get out of it. Well, in this case, there are a number of good ways to answer this threat. The simplest and the safest way to do it is to just move the king out of the way, making sure there are no discoveries whatsoever. Obviously, now a move like knight e5 would lose sense altogether because black could just simply capture that piece. So the evaluation in this position would be black avoided the trap and maintained his material advantage. Let's look at other options. Another option would be the same idea to get out of the discovery by playing g6, blocking up that same diagonal, so now again if the white knight moves, it will not be a check at the same time. Yet another option would be to move the queen to f5. Again, this stops any check. In fact, it creates kind of a pin over the white knight. The white knight has to be very careful where it would go, not to lose the queen for nothing. In addition to the already mentioned options, another option would be to move the queen to e6. I have to say that this is kind of a little bit playing with fire, and I would not recommend to you to do that. The best would be move the king out of the way to make sure no accidents happen. You may wonder, but how does this move solve our problem? If the knight would still go to c5, it's still a discovered check, and the knight attacks the queen. Well, the difference now is that the queen is positioned in a better place to save itself, namely to block the check and move the queen away from the attack simultaneously. Also, if the white knight would rather move to f4, trying again to win black's queen, even though the queen cannot healthily move to g6, it can move to e4 as its rook protects the queen. After white would capture the queen, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, black would be just fine. Going back to the starting position for just one more moment, we so far primarily talked about the scenario if you were on the black side of the board and how to react after queen c2. Now, how should you deal with a position like this if you're white? Well, since black already has a significant material advantage, I would suggest try to set a trap with queen c2 and see if your opponent would fall for it. Even though, after black's correct defense, black can avoid trouble. But nevertheless, white didn't risk anything because white didn't sacrifice anything, and even if black finds the best move, black does not gain any further material. Let's move on to our next example, where it is again white's turn. The question needs to be asked, as always, what does our opponent want to do? In this case, what would be black's next move if black could make another move in a row, which obviously he cannot? Well, if it would be black's turn again, the bishop would simply capture that knight. So obviously that is the threat. Now, the difficulty is that if white would choose to move the knight out of the attack, then black would get the opportunity to then capture the rook that's behind the knight. Counterattacking the opponent's rook by playing knight e3 would not be a good idea, because after bishop takes rook and knight takes rook, the bishop captures back, leaving black with an extra bishop. Going back to the beginning, the question remains, what should white do? Well, if moving the knight doesn't work, counterattacking to the opponent's rook doesn't work, there is only one option left, and that is to protect the knight that has been attacked. And the only piece that can achieve that is white's rook. In fact, that rook has two options, to protect it from the side or to protect it from behind. In this case, protecting the knight from the side would clearly be a mistake, because it would give black the opportunity to then create a pin with rook d4, attacking the knight a second time and winning the knight. As we know, pins are very, very dangerous, and in this case, if the pinned knight would move, white would simply lose the rook on b4. On the other hand, much better would be to play rook to c3. First of all, it saves the knight without losing any material whatsoever, and moreover, it creates a trick. Without gambling, without risking anything, it creates a threat. So in this case, if black is careless, for example, moves his king up, then white could win black's rook with a discovered check. All of a sudden, now the black king is under attack, and so is black's rook on d1. Black needs to get out of the check, and then the rook is lost. Let's see the next example. In this rook endgame, white has an extra pawn. However, in situations when it's only one extra pawn with a pair of rooks on the board with no other pieces or pawns, and the weaker side's king can easily reach the squares near the promotion square, especially when the passed pawn is a rook pawn. That is, it's a file that's near the edge of the board, the A or H files. The game is relatively an easy draw. Black can just hang out with the rook on the 8th rank and then with the king around the corner, making sure the king doesn't let the pawn through to become a queen. So in this situation, making the so-called straightforward moves, let's say such as king g3, or for example advancing the pawn, we know it wouldn't go anywhere because the pawn will be held off by black's king. So here white can do a last trick that's worth trying, moving the rook to f1. Now, on the other hand, if you're playing black, always be careful and suspicious of your opponent. After all, your opponent is there to set traps for you and try to outsmart you. So in this case, white voluntarily leaves protecting the pawn on h4. So if the black rook would get greedy and capture it, then white would be ready with a discovery, opening up the rook's file to check black's king and at the same time win the rook on h4. Naturally, if we go back to the starting position and we make white's move rook f1, there is absolutely no obligation for black to capture that pawn. Naturally, black should just move the king towards the white pawn and then, as I mentioned earlier, just kind of wait around and make sure the white pawn doesn't get promoted and remain on the board. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this endgame, there is an imbalanced position where white has a rook, a bishop, and a knight, which if you combine their value is equaling to 11, versus black having an extra queen and pawn equaling to 10. So at the moment, white has a small material advantage. White right now captured black's pawn on d5. And generally, when the opponent captures one of our pieces and we can recapture, we should. However, always have to be careful, especially when we would be stepping onto an X-ray situation. Like in this case, we see the bishop, we see the knight, and we see the queen all on the same diagonal. This is an extremely dangerous situation. And because the black king is on h7 and not, for example, on h8 in the corner, it enables white to create an immediate discovery and to win black's queen. This would be a very sad story for black because now, even after pawn takes knight, the bishop would take the queen, and now white's material advantage is absolutely devastating for black, white having an extra rook and bishop. Going back to the beginning, after pawn takes pawn, it would still be the smaller damage if black would not capture the pawn on d5, give up on that pawn, and let's say bring the rook into the game by playing rook e8, for example. Even though white would still have a small material advantage. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position again, we need to ask ourselves, what does our opponent want to do? And if you give yourself a little bit of time, I bet you'll figure out that the black knight from c5 is aiming right at our rook on d3. And that's certainly not a good thing for us. But you may wonder, where is the discovery? At this moment, indeed, there is no discovery yet. However, after the next move, and that move moves the rook away from the danger, and at the same time forces black's king onto the discovery. So the way to accomplish this is to make a forceful move, a check with the rook. And because the black king is in its castled position with the rook on its left-hand side, the black king has no other choice but to move to the corner. And now we can already see what we're looking for, the participants of the discovery. Any place the white knight goes right now, it will be a check by white's bishop. However, the most effective jump is to move to d5. Naturally, the black pawn cannot capture the knight because black is in check, and by the time black reacts to that, they can kiss goodbye to their rook. Another perfect example how powerful discoveries are. Let's move on and look at this endgame position. In this situation, even though black has 3 pieces, 2 knights and a bishop, as compensation for white's extra queen, white has a very active position, and playing correctly, white can gain material advantage right now. However, not with the obvious looking move, which would be to play f4. It's very important to always not just look for our attacking moves or our tactical opportunities, but also to make sure we avoid the opponent. Like in this case, pushing the pawn up to f4 would be a major blunder, because it would allow b5 opening the black's bishop's diagonal, checking the king and winning white's queen. Would be a serious blunder for white. On the other hand, the correct solution is to play h4, chasing black's knight out of the way, and if the knight, for example, goes to e6, then white would be ready to centralize the queen on e4 and create at the same time a double attack on black's rook and other knight. Have to be very careful and always to look out for the opponent's traps. Let's move on. Here we go. In this endgame, it was black's turn, and white has just captured a pawn on e6. And this is one of those situations where normally we would automatically recapture the pawn. However, that would create again an opportunity for discovered check for white. Definitely something that black needs to avoid. Here, bishop e5 or bishop a5 both win material, although this move is clearly better because it clearly wins black's queen, while if white would try the same from the other side, black at least would get the opportunity to retreat the queen, and while losing his queen, forcing white to give up his own rook as well. But what should black do in this position instead of capturing the pawn? Well, the best option was to retreat the queen to c6, attacking white's rook. If right now white simply moves the rook away, then black could capture white's pawn, in fact first the one on e4 with a check, and then capture the second pawn on e6. But what about if after queen c6, white chooses to capture another pawn which is about to get promoted? Well, black will arrive just on time by moving the king right next to the pawn and then try capturing it. The big difference now is that after the rook moves away, black can safely capture white's pawns because the black queen is on a light square, and therefore it doesn't matter where the white bishop moves now. There is no way it can attack black's queen. A very important point. Let's follow up the next example. Here we go. In this situation, there is an almost discovery, but white has just one too many pieces in between the rook and the king. Obviously, white cannot move both of them away at the same time. However, white has a very nice little combination here to gain material or checkmate. Try to figure it out on your own and then come back to check the correct answer. The right move here is bishop captures pawn, attacking black's rook. If that rook moves away, it doesn't help the situation because white would still have a double check with the knight. But what's wrong with knight capturing the bishop? Well, big problem that white checkmates in 2 moves now. By giving a discovered and doubled check, meaning that both the knight and the rook is attacking the king right now, which means that black is unable to block the check, the king must move out, and then white is ready to checkmate with the knight's help. A beautiful checkmate with rook and knight. Let's see the next example. Here we go. In this simple looking endgame, white could play bishop b2. If you're playing black, it's really important that you notice that this is a sneaky, tricky move. Namely, it creates a discovery threat. And if black is careless, for example, attacks white's knight, that would just invite white to play knight d5, discovery, and then winning the knight. So what should black do instead of pushing the pawn? Just like in the first example we saw, black should either move the king out of the way, make sure there is no discovery, or to accomplish the same, push the pawn up to f6 with an approximately equal position. And our final example in this lesson, here we go. In this middle game situation where it's black's turn, black should hurry up and develop his undeveloped bishop. And that's exactly what black was trying to do when black moved the pawn up to b6 with the idea to fianchetto the bishop. The problem is it created an opportunity for white to make a discovered attack by advancing the d pawn, sacrificing that little pawn, however, then winning a much more valuable piece, black's rook. On the other hand, black could have and should have developed the bishop to d7, for example, without endangering his rook. Well, I hope you learned some more about discovery and how to get out of it or how to avoid it. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.